should have listened to the warnings about Red Creek Farm. This is a horror story about what happens when greed leads a man into the darkest corners of rural Alabama, where some harvests are meant to stay buried forever. Red Creek Farm, Alabama, 1972. My name is Thomas Mitchell, and in October of 1972, I was a desperate real estate developer from Birmingham who thought I'd found the deal of a lifetime. The abandoned Red Creek Farm had been sitting empty for 3 years, and the asking price was so low it seemed like a gift from heaven. What I discovered during my 3-day inspection of that cursed property changed everything I believed about the world, about death, and about the terrible price some people pay for their sins. The cornfields whispered secrets that should have stayed silent, the farmhouse held memories that should have remained buried, and the harvest moon revealed horrors that no man should ever witness. If you like real horror stories, leave your like on this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. The October air in rural Alabama carried the smell of dying leaves and something else I couldn't quite identify as I pulled my dusty Buick up the gravel driveway of Red Creek Farm. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of amber and rust, making the abandoned farmhouse look almost welcoming from a distance. Almost. But there was something wrong with the picture, something that made my skin crawl even as I tried to focus on the business opportunity ahead of me. The cornfield stretched endlessly in every direction, their stalks brown and brittle, swaying in a wind that seemed to blow from nowhere and everywhere at once. Her abandoned farmhouse. My real estate license had been gathering dust for months, and this property represented my last chance to salvage a career that was drowning in debt and broken promises. The previous owner, a man named Ezekiel Crow, had died 3 years ago under circumstances the locals preferred not to discuss, leaving behind this sprawling farm that nobody wanted to buy, nobody wanted to talk about, and apparently, nobody wanted to remember. As I stepped out of my car, the silence hit me like a physical weight. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, just the endless whisper of dried corn husks rubbing against each other in the breeze. The farmhouse loomed ahead of me, its white paint peeling like diseased skin, and for the first time since I'd heard about this property, I wondered if some deals were too good to be true. Tell me in the comments what you think Thomas should have done when he first felt that something was wrong. I grabbed my briefcase and survey equipment from the trunk, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me like a burial shroud. The gravel crunched beneath my feet with each step toward the house, and I noticed that weeds had grown up through the stones, creating patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost ritualistic. Survey equipment. The smell I'd noticed earlier was getting stronger now, sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit mixed with something that reminded me of the meat locker behind my uncle's butcher shop back in Birmingham. Every window in the farmhouse stared down at me like empty eye sockets, their glass either missing or so dirty it might as well have been painted black. The front porch sagged under the weight of 3 years of neglect, and I could see that several of the floorboards had rotted completely through, leaving dark gaps that seemed to breathe with the wind. My hands were sweating as I fumbled for the keys the realtor had given me, and I kept glancing over my shoulder at the cornfields, convinced that I could see movement among the stalks even though logic told me it was just the wind. The key turned in the lock with surprising ease, as if the house was eager to let me in, and the front door swung open with a long, low creak that sounded almost like a sigh of relief. The darkness beyond the threshold seemed thicker than it should have been for 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and as I stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't just entering an empty house, I was walking into something that had been waiting for me. Tell me what city and country you're watching from, because I have a feeling this story is going to travel far beyond the borders of Alabama. The interior of the farmhouse hit me with a wave of stale air that tasted of dust, mildew, and that same sickly sweet smell that seemed to permeate everything about this place. Farmhouse interior. My footsteps echoed hollowly on the warped wooden floors as I made my way through the front hallway, noting the water stains on the wallpaper that formed shapes that looked unsettlingly like reaching hands. The realtor had told me that Ezekiel Crow had lived alone here for the last 20 years of his life, becoming increasingly reclusive after his wife disappeared one autumn night in 1952. But standing in this suffocating darkness, I could almost feel the weight of his solitude pressing down on me like a physical thing. Family photographs still hung on the walls, their faces obscured by layers of grime and what looked like smoke damage, and I found myself wondering what had happened in this house during those final years. What kind of life the old man had lived surrounded by all this decay and abandonment. The floorboards groaned ominously under my weight as I moved through the rooms, and more than once I had the distinct impression that the house was testing me, measuring my resolve, deciding whether I was worthy of its secrets. In the kitchen, I found dishes still sitting in the sink, covered with a layer of mold so thick it looked like green velvet, and the refrigerator door hung open like a gaping mouth, its interior long since cleaned out by whatever scavengers had made their way through here over the past 3 years. But it was the basement door that really caught my attention. Painted bright red while everything else in the house was faded and grey, it stood out like a wound in the kitchen wall, and I could swear I heard something moving behind it, something that sounded almost like breathing. My rational mind kept telling me that houses make noises, that old wood settles and shifts, that the sounds I was hearing were nothing more than the normal complaints of a structure that had been abandoned for 3 years. But my gut was screaming something entirely different as I approached that red door, my hand trembling as I reached for the brass knob that was worn smooth by decades of use. Basement door. The door opened easily, revealing a set of wooden stairs that descended into absolute darkness, and the smell that wafted up from below was so overpowering that I had to step back and cover my nose with my sleeve. It was the smell of earth and decay, of things that had been buried and forgotten, of secrets that had been left to rot in the dark. I pulled out my flashlight and aimed the beam down the stairs, but the darkness seemed to swallow the light after just a few feet, and I could see that the walls were made of rough stone, wet with moisture that gleamed like blood in the yellow glow. My business sense told me that basements were important for property evaluation, that I needed to check the foundation and look for any structural damage that might affect the sale price, but every instinct I had was telling me to turn around and walk away, to forget about this property and find some other way to save my failing career. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight as I slowly began my descent, and with each step I took, the temperature seemed to drop another degree, until I could see my breath misting in the air before me. Halfway down, I paused and called out, "Hello," into the darkness, and the sound of my own voice echoing back at me from the depths below was so distorted, so wrong, that I almost turned and ran right then and there. The basement was larger than I had expected, extending far beyond the footprint of the house above, and my flashlight beam revealed rough stone walls that were covered with what looked like scratches, hundreds of them, carved deep into the rock as if someone had spent years clawing at them with their bare hands. Basement scratches. The floor was packed dirt, and as I moved the light slowly across its surface, I could see that it was uneven, marked with long mounds and shallow depressions that looked disturbingly like graves. The air down here was thick and humid, heavy with the smell of decomposition and something else, something chemical and sharp that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. In the far corner, barely visible in the weak glow of my flashlight, I could make out what looked like an old workbench covered with tools that gleamed dully in the darkness, and hanging from the ceiling above it were ropes, dozens of them, all cut to different lengths and tied with knots that formed patterns I didn't recognize, but that filled me with an inexplicable dread. My grandfather had been a farmer, and I knew that basements like this were often used for storing root vegetables and preserving meat, but there was something about this space that felt wrong, something that suggested it had been used for purposes that had nothing to do with normal agricultural activities. As I moved deeper into the basement, my foot caught on something soft and yielding, and when I looked down I saw that the dirt floor was littered with what looked like pieces of cloth, scraps of fabric in various colors that had been scattered around like confetti after some terrible celebration. But it wasn't until I bent down to examine them more closely that I realized they weren't just random pieces of cloth. They were fragments of clothing, torn and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls as my hand shook with a fear that I was only beginning to understand. Torn clothing. This wasn't just an abandoned basement. This was a place where terrible things had happened, where someone had done unspeakable acts in the darkness while the world above went on with its normal business. The scratches on the walls weren't just random marks. They were the desperate clawings of people who had been brought down here against their will, people who had spent their final moments trying to escape from whatever horrors Ezekiel Crowe had inflicted upon them. My mind raced with the implications, with the understanding that I was standing in what amounted to a tomb, a place where human lives had been snuffed out like candles in a hurricane. I thought about the missing wife, about the locals' reluctance to talk about the old man's death, about the way the realtor's voice had dropped to a whisper when he'd mentioned the property's history. I thought about all the people who might have disappeared over the years, all the families who had lost loved ones and never known what happened to them, never suspected that their answers lay buried in the dirt floor of a basement that reeked of death and despair. My legs felt weak as I turned to head back up the stairs, and I was so focused on getting out of that hellish place that I almost missed the sound that froze my blood in my veins, the soft scraping of footsteps somewhere in the darkness behind me, footsteps that definitely weren't my own echoing back from the walls. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness like a sword, but I saw nothing except the empty basement stretching away into shadows that seemed deeper and more menacing than before. Footsteps in darkness. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure it could be heard throughout the entire house, and my breath was coming in short, sharp gasps that misted in the cold air like tiny ghosts. The rational part of my mind was desperately trying to explain away what I'd heard. Maybe it was rats, maybe it was the house settling, Maybe it was just the echo of my own footsteps playing tricks on my frightened imagination. But I knew what I'd heard, and it wasn't any of those things. Those had been human footsteps, slow and deliberate, the careful movements of someone who knew this basement intimately, someone who belonged here in the darkness among the scratched walls and the scattered pieces of clothing. I started backing toward the stairs, never taking my eyes off the depths of the basement, my flashlight sweeping back and forth in desperate arcs as I tried to penetrate shadows that seemed to shift and move just beyond the reach of the light. The smell was getting stronger now, that sickly sweet odor of decay and corruption, and underneath it I could detect something else, something that smelled like burning sulfur and rotting flowers. My foot found the bottom step, and I began climbing as quickly as I dared, the wooden boards creaking ominously under my weight, and with each step I took I expected to feel a hand grab my ankle, to hear a voice call out from the darkness below, to discover that whatever was down there had no intention of letting me leave alive. I burst through the basement door and into the kitchen with such force that I nearly fell, slamming the red door behind me and leaning against it as if my body weight could somehow keep whatever was down there from following me up those stairs. Kitchen escape. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely hold my flashlight steady, and I was covered in a cold sweat that made my shirt stick to my back like a second skin. The kitchen, with its moldy dishes and gaping refrigerator, suddenly seemed like a sanctuary compared to the horrors I'd just witnessed below, and I found myself laughing with hysterical relief at the simple pleasure of being surrounded by ordinary, everyday decay instead of the malevolent darkness of that basement. But even as I tried to calm myself down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me up those stairs, that some invisible presence was now sharing the kitchen with me, watching me from the shadows and waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. The air in the kitchen felt different now, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arm stand up, and every creak of the old house sounded like footsteps. Every whisper of wind through the broken windows sounded like voices calling my name. I knew I should leave, knew I should walk out of this house and never look back, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was professional obligation, maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe it was the growing certainty that if I left now without understanding what I'd stumbled into, I would never be able to live with myself. The late afternoon sun was fading outside, and through the dirty windows I could see the cornfields taking on the deep purple shadows of approaching dusk, and I realized that I had a choice to make. I could run away like a coward, or I could stay and face whatever secrets this house was hiding. The decision was made for me when I heard the sound of a car engine in the distance, growing louder as it approached the farmhouse, and through the kitchen window I could see headlights cutting through the gathering darkness like twin eyes searching for prey. Car approaching. My first thought was relief. Maybe it was the local sheriff making his rounds, or another real estate agent coming to check on the property, or just some lost traveler looking for directions. But as the car drew closer, that relief turned to dread as I realized that whoever was coming here knew exactly where they were going, and they weren't planning to leave anytime soon. I watched through the window as a beat-up pickup truck pulled into the gravel driveway and parked next to my Buick, and in the glow of the headlights I could see two figures getting out, both wearing dark clothing and moving with the purposeful stride of people who had business here, people who belonged in this place of shadows and secrets. I quickly turned off my flashlight and pressed myself against the kitchen wall, trying to make myself invisible as I listened to the sound of boots crunching on gravel, coming closer with each passing second. Voices drifted through the evening air, low and urgent, speaking in accents thick with the rural Alabama dialect that I'd never quite learned to understand, but their tone was unmistakable. These weren't friendly visitors, and they definitely weren't here to welcome a newcomer to the neighborhood. I could hear them moving around the outside of the house, and then one of them called out in a voice that chilled me to the bone. "We know you're in there, city boy." Ezekiel told us someone would come, told us what to do when they did. The words hit me like ice water in my veins, and I felt my knees go weak as the full implications of what I'd heard sank into my terrified brain. Ezekiel's prediction. Ezekiel Crow had been dead for 3 years, but somehow he'd known that someone like me would eventually come to Red Creek Farm, and he'd left instructions for these people about what to do when it happened. I thought about the basement, about the scratched walls and the scattered clothing, about the smell of death and decay that permeated everything in this cursed place, and I began to understand that I hadn't just stumbled into an abandoned property. I'd walked into a trap that had been set years ago by a dead man who was still somehow pulling the strings from beyond the grave. The voices were getting closer now, and I could hear them discussing the best way to get into the house, could hear them talking about me like I was already dead, like they were just going through the motions of some ritual they'd performed before. My mind raced as I tried to think of a way out, but the front door was in full view of where they were standing, and the back door was at the other end of the house, past rooms I hadn't explored yet, through darkness that could hide any number of dangers. I could feel panic rising in my chest like flood water, threatening to drown me in its cold embrace, and I had to bite down on my knuckle to keep from crying out as I heard the front door creak open and footsteps begin echoing through the hallway. They were inside now, hunting for me through the rooms of the dead man's house, and I knew with absolute certainty that if they found me, I would become another set of scratches on the basement walls, another pile of torn clothing scattered across that dirt floor. I forced myself to move, creeping through the kitchen toward what I hoped was a back exit, my sock-covered feet making almost no sound on the warped wooden floors as I navigated by memory and the faint starlight filtering through the dirty windows. Creeping through house. Behind me, I could hear the two men systematically searching the house, their heavy boots echoing through the rooms as they called out to each other in voices that sounded almost cheerful, as if this was some kind of game they enjoyed playing. The hallway stretched ahead of me like a tunnel into hell, lined with doorways that gaped like open mouths in the darkness, and every step I took brought me deeper into a house that seemed to be closing around me like a living thing. I passed what must have been a living room, where furniture sat covered in white sheets that looked like ghosts in the pale light, and then a dining room where a long table was still set with plates and silverware as if Ezekiel Crowe had been expecting dinner guests who never arrived. The smell was stronger here, that sickly sweet odor of corruption that seemed to ooze from the very walls, and I had to cover my nose with my sleeve to keep from gagging as I crept past family portraits whose eyes seemed to follow my movement through the shadows. Behind me, one of the men called out, found his car keys, and the other responded with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. Won't be needing those anymore. The casual cruelty in their voices told me everything I needed to know about my chances of survival if they caught me, and I quickened my pace, abandoning stealth for speed as I searched desperately for any way out of this nightmare that had once been someone's home. At the end of the hallway, I found what I'd been looking for, a back door that opened onto a small porch overlooking the cornfields, and through its glass panels I could see the endless rows of brown stalks swaying in the night breeze like a sea of dead soldiers. Back door to cornfields. My hands fumbled with the lock, and I nearly sobbed with relief when it turned easily and the door swung open to let in a rush of cold air that carried the smell of dying vegetation and damp earth. Behind me, I could hear the men getting closer, their voices growing louder as they realized I was no longer in the front part of the house, and I knew I had maybe 30 seconds before they reached the back door and saw me running across the open ground toward the cornfield. I took a deep breath and sprinted across the porch and down the wooden steps, my feet hitting the soft earth with impacts that seemed to echo across the landscape like gunshots, and behind me I heard one of them shout, "There he goes!" into the corn. The stalks closed around me like a curtain as I plunged into the field, and suddenly I was surrounded by a maze of brown vegetation that rustled and whispered with every movement, creating a symphony of sound that masked my footsteps but also hid any noise my pursuers might be making as they followed me into the labyrinth. The cornstalks were taller than I'd expected, rising above my head and blocking out most of the starlight, and I quickly realized that I was running blind through a maze where every direction looked exactly the same. I could hear them behind me, crashing through the corn with the confidence of people who knew these fields like their own backyard, and their voices called out to each other as they coordinated their search. Circle around to the north, and I'll take the creek side, and most chilling of all, he can't run forever. The corn maze became my world, a claustrophobic prison of brown stalks and rustling leaves where every step could be my last and every sound could be the approach of death. Corn maze prison. My business suit was completely unsuited for this kind of desperate flight, and I could feel the fabric tearing as sharp edges of dried corn leaves slashed at my face and hands, drawing lines of blood that mixed with the sweat pouring down my cheeks. My lungs burned with each ragged breath I took, and my legs felt like they were made of lead as I stumbled through the maze, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the voices that seemed to be coming from every direction at once. The field was much larger than it had appeared from the farmhouse, stretching on for what felt like miles in every direction, and I began to understand that this wasn't just a hiding place. It was another trap, another part of Ezekiel Crowe's carefully laid plan to ensure that anyone who discovered his secrets would never live to tell them. The corn whispered around me with voices that sounded almost human, and more than once I spun around thinking I'd heard someone call my name, only to find nothing but brown stalks swaying in the breeze. Time became meaningless in that maze, and I lost all sense of direction as I stumbled through row after row of identical corn, my only goal to keep moving, to stay ahead of the men who were hunting me like an animal through the darkness. But gradually I became aware that the sounds of pursuit were growing fainter, and when I finally stopped to listen, gasping for breath in a small clearing between the rows, I realized that I could no longer hear their voices at all. The silence that surrounded me in the heart of the cornfield was more terrifying than any sound could have been, because it meant that I was truly alone in a place where terrible things happened to people who asked too many questions. Terrifying silence. I stood perfectly still, trying to control my ragged breathing as I strained to hear any sound that might tell me where my pursuers were, but the only noise was the endless whisper of corn leaves rubbing against each other and the distant sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The moon had risen while I'd been running, casting everything in a pale silver light that made the cornfield look like the surface of an alien planet, and in that ghostly illumination I could see that the ground around me was littered with objects that didn't belong in a normal agricultural setting. There were pieces of clothing scattered among the cornstalks, scraps of fabric that looked like they'd been torn from people who had run through this same maze before me, people who had been hunted through these rows by the same men who were now pursuing me. I knelt down and picked up what looked like a child's shoe, small and red with a pattern of flowers on the side, and the sight of it filled me with a rage and horror so intense that I had to fight to keep from screaming. How many people had died in these fields over the years? How many victims had Ezekiel Crow and his followers claimed in their twisted rituals? And how many more would die before someone finally stopped them? I dropped the shoe and stood up, and that's when I saw it, a gap in the corn ahead of me, a place where the stalks had been cleared away to create a perfect circle about 20 feet across, and in the center of that circle stood something that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was an altar made of rough stone, dark with stains that could only be blood, and around its base were arranged dozens of objects that told the story of all the people who had been brought here against their will over the years. Stone altar, children's toys, jewelry, pieces of clothing, personal items that represented lives cut short by the madness of a man who had somehow convinced others to help him in his terrible work. The altar was carved with symbols that hurt to look at, twisted shapes that seemed to move and writhe in the moonlight, and hanging from wooden posts driven into the ground around the circle were more pieces of torn clothing, fluttering in the breeze like prayer flags in some hellish temple. I could smell the metallic scent of old blood and something else, something that reminded me of the sulfur I'd detected in the basement, and I realized that this place was still being used, that whatever ritual Ezekiel Crow had performed here wasn't something that had died with him 3 years ago. The ground around the altar was packed hard from years of use, worn smooth by the feet of people who had gathered here to witness unspeakable acts, and I could see paths leading away through the corn in several different directions, like spokes on a wheel with this cursed clearing as its hub. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, trying to understand the full scope of the horror I'd stumbled into, I heard the sound that I'd been dreading since I first entered the cornfield, the slow, measured approach of footsteps coming through the stalks toward the clearing. They had found me, and there was nowhere left to run. The two men stepped into the clearing with the casual confidence of people who had done this many times before, and in the moonlight I could see their faces clearly for the first time, weathered, bearded faces with eyes that held no trace of human compassion, only the cold calculation of predators who had cornered their prey. Predators revealed. They were dressed in dark work clothes that were stained with substances I didn't want to identify, and each of them carried tools that were definitely not intended for agricultural work, a long-handled sledgehammer and what looked like a ceremonial knife with a curved blade that gleamed like liquid silver in the pale light. The taller of the two men smiled when he saw me, her expression so devoid of warmth that it looked like a skull's grimace, and his voice when he spoke was soft and conversational, as if we were old friends meeting for a casual chat. "You shouldn't have gone down into the basement, city boy. Some doors are meant to stay closed, some secrets are meant to stay buried." His companion nodded and added, "Ezekiel told us this would happen someday, told us someone would come sniffing around asking questions they didn't want answered. He told us what to do about it." I backed away from them until I felt the rough stone of the altar against my spine, and the irony wasn't lost on me that I was trapped against the very thing that represented the evil I'd been trying to escape. My voice cracked when I tried to speak, but I forced the words out anyway. "I'm just a real estate agent. I don't want any trouble. I'll leave right now and forget I was ever here." The tall man laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves, and shook his head slowly. "Oh, you'll leave all right, but not the way you came." The shorter man began walking slowly around the perimeter of the clearing, and I realized he was checking to make sure there were no gaps in the circle of corn where I might try to escape, no weaknesses in their trap that might allow their prey to slip away at the last moment. Checking the trap, the tall man continued talking, his voice taking on the rhythm of someone reciting a well-rehearsed speech. "This land has been in our families for generations, and it's always demanded a price. Blood for the harvest, life for the corn, souls for the soil." Ezekiel understood that better than anyone, knew that some things were more important than laws and civilization and all the other lies people tell themselves to sleep at night. He hefted the sledgehammer in his hands, testing its weight, and I could see dark stains on its metal head that told me exactly how it had been used before. "Your blood will feed these fields just like all the others, and when the corn grows tall next summer, you'll be part of it, part of something bigger and older than your small city mind could ever comprehend." I tried to run then, pure panic overriding any rational thought, but the shorter man was ready for me and caught my arm in a grip that felt like a steel vise. His breath was hot against my ear when he whispered, "Ezekiel's watching us right now, you know. He's been waiting 3 years for someone like you to come along. He's been hungry all this time." The smell of decay and corruption that had followed me from the basement was stronger here, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't coming from the altar or the scattered remains around the clearing. It was coming from the men themselves, as if they carried death with them wherever they went. But just as the tall man raised his sledgehammer and I closed my eyes and prepared for the end, the night exploded with light and sound as every car alarm in the county seemed to go off at once, followed by the unmistakable wail of police sirens approaching at high speed. Sirens and lights. The two men spun around in confusion, their carefully planned ritual suddenly interrupted by the harsh intrusion of the modern world. And in that moment of distraction, I managed to tear free from the shorter man's grip and dive into the corn on the far side of the clearing. Behind me, I could hear them cursing and crashing through the stalks in pursuit, but they were no longer the calm, confident predators they'd been moments before. Now they were desperate men who knew their time was running out, and desperation made them clumsy. The sirens were getting louder, and through the gaps in the corn I could see the flashing red and blue lights of what looked like half the police cars in Alabama converging on Red Creek Farm. I had no idea who had called them or how they'd known to come, but I didn't stop to wonder about my good fortune as I ran through the maze of corn toward what I hoped was safety. The voices of my pursuers were growing fainter behind me, and I realized they'd given up the chase in favor of escaping before the police could surround the property. My legs felt like rubber and my lungs were on fire, but I kept running until I burst out of the cornfield and onto a dirt road where 3 police cruisers were parked with their doors open and their radios crackling with urgent communications. A young sheriff's deputy caught me as I stumbled, and his voice was gentle when he said, "It's okay, son. You're safe now. We got your signal." I stared at him in confusion, my mind still reeling from everything I'd experienced, and it took several seconds for his words to penetrate the fog of terror and exhaustion that had settled over my brain. Confusion and rescue. My signal. I gasped, and he nodded toward my briefcase, which I'd somehow managed to hang onto through all my desperate running through the cornfield. "The emergency beacon in your surveying equipment activated about an hour ago. We've been tracking your location ever since." I looked down at my briefcase in amazement, remembering that I'd bought the most expensive surveying kit I could afford, complete with an automatic distress signal that was supposed to activate if the equipment detected certain dangerous conditions: extreme temperature changes, toxic gases, structural instability. Apparently, whatever evil had been lurking in that basement had been enough to trigger the safety systems, and that electronic signal had saved my life when human intervention would have come too late. The deputy helped me into the back of his cruiser and handed me a blanket, and as we drove away from Red Creek Farm, I could see other officers searching the cornfield with powerful flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness like swords seeking out the shadows where evil men might be hiding. The tall man and his companion were nowhere to be found, having melted back into the rural Alabama night like the creatures of darkness they were, but I knew they were out there somewhere, waiting for their next opportunity to feed their cursed fields with innocent blood. As we drove toward town, the deputy told me that Red Creek Farm had been under investigation for years, that dozens of people had disappeared in the area over the past 2 decades, but they'd never been able to prove anything or find enough evidence to make arrests. The investigation that followed my escape from Red Creek Farm became one of the largest criminal cases in Alabama history, with teams of forensic specialists spending months excavating the basement and cornfield, uncovering evidence of horrors that made headline news across the country. Massive investigation. They found the remains of 37 people buried in that basement, men and women and children who had disappeared over the years, all of them victims of what investigators called a modern-day cult that had perverted ancient agricultural rituals into something unspeakably evil. The altar in the cornfield yielded DNA evidence linking the murders to not just Ezekiel Crow but to a network of families throughout rural Alabama who had been participating in these twisted ceremonies for generations, passing down their sick traditions from father to son like some hereditary disease. The 2 men who had hunted me through the corn were eventually identified as Luther and Jacob Whitmore, brothers who had been Ezekiel's closest disciples, and they were captured 3 months later trying to cross into Mississippi with a teenage girl they'd kidnapped from a truck stop outside Montgomery. The trial was a media circus that exposed the dark underbelly of rural isolation and the terrible things that could happen when religious fervor twisted into something monstrous. But for me, the legal proceedings were just background noise to the real horror of what I'd experienced, the knowledge that I'd walked into a place where pure evil had taken root and flourished for decades while the outside world went about its business in blissful ignorance. The nightmares started almost immediately after my rescue. Vivid dreams where I was back in that basement surrounded by scratched walls and the smell of death. where I was running through endless cornfields while voices called my name from the shadows. The psychological impact of my 3 hours at Red Creek Farm followed me back to Birmingham like a shadow I couldn't shake, infiltrating every aspect of my life until I could barely function in the normal world anymore. Psychological aftermath. My real estate career was finished, not because of any legal complications, but because I couldn't bring myself to enter another empty building without experiencing panic attacks that left me gasping on the floor like a landed fish. The smell of corn on the cob cooking at summer barbecues sent me into cold sweats, and I had to leave the grocery store whenever I walked past the produce section and caught sight of those innocent yellow kernels that reminded me of the maze where I'd nearly died. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford, because closing my eyes meant returning to Red Creek Farm in my dreams, meant reliving that night over and over again with variations that were somehow worse than the reality had been. In my nightmares, the police never came, the 2 men caught me at the altar, and I became another set of scratches on the basement walls. In other dreams, I discovered that I'd never actually escaped at all, that I was still trapped in that house of horrors, and everything since then, the rescue, the investigation, the trial, was just a dying hallucination playing out in my mind as my life ebbed away on the stone altar. I tried therapy, tried medication, tried every form of treatment available to someone suffering from what the doctors called severe post-traumatic stress disorder, but nothing could erase the knowledge that places like Red Creek Farm existed in the world, that there were people walking among us who had surrendered their humanity to something ancient and evil and hungry. Years passed, and gradually I learned to live with the memories, to function despite the scars that the experience had left on my soul, but I never forgot the lessons I'd learned in that cornfield about the thin line between civilization and chaos. Years of healing. I moved away from Alabama, eventually settling in a small town in Colorado where the mountains felt safer than the endless flatlands where corn could grow, where evil could take root and flourish unseen. I found work as a carpenter, something that kept my hands busy and my mind focused on concrete, immediate problems rather than the abstract horrors that lurked in the shadows of human nature. I married a good woman who was patient with my quirks and understanding about why I sometimes woke up screaming in the middle of the night, why I couldn't watch horror movies or eat corn or drive past farmhouses without breaking into a cold sweat. We had children, 2 beautiful daughters who brought light into the dark corners of my world, and slowly I began to believe that maybe I could build a normal life despite everything I'd been through. But Red Creek Farm never really left me, never stopped haunting the quiet moments when my guard was down and my mind wandered back to that October night in 1972. Sometimes I would catch myself staring out at fields of wheat or barley, searching the horizon for movement among the stalks, listening for voices that shouldn't be there, waiting for the next harvest to begin. The rational part of my mind knew that Luther and Jacob Whitmore were both serving life sentences in maximum security prisons, that their cult had been broken up and scattered, that the farm itself had been bulldozed and the land sold to developers who built a shopping mall where the cursed cornfields used to grow. But knowledge and belief are 2 different things, and deep down I've never been able to shake the conviction that what I encountered at Red Creek Farm was bigger than just one man's madness or one family's twisted traditions. Lingering conviction. The evil I felt in that basement, the malevolent presence that seemed to permeate every inch of that property, wasn't something that could be destroyed by bulldozers or dispersed by development. It was something that had been feeding on human suffering for far longer than Ezekiel Crowe had been alive, something that had found a perfect home in the isolation of rural Alabama where screams could echo across empty fields without anyone hearing them, where people could disappear without anyone asking too many questions. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I research other cases of missing persons in rural areas, looking for patterns that might suggest the cancer has spread to other farms in other states, other communities where ancient hungers might have taken root among people desperate enough or broken enough to feed them. I've found more than I care to think about, clusters of disappearances around certain properties, families with histories of strange accidents and unexplained deaths, police reports that mention unusual agricultural rituals and crops that grow with unnatural vigor. The internet has made it easier to find these stories, these scattered pieces of a puzzle that most people would never think to put together, and I've begun to understand that Red Creek Farm might have been just one small part of something much larger and more terrifying than I could have imagined. There are places in this country where the old ways never died, where people still believe that the land demands blood and the harvest requires sacrifice, where civilization is just a thin veneer over practices that would have been familiar to our ancestors thousands of years ago. And so I live with the knowledge that somewhere out there, in some forgotten corner of rural America, another corn maze is growing tall and dark under the summer sun, another basement is being prepared for unspeakable purposes, another altar is waiting for its next offering of innocent blood. Our ongoing horror. I've tried to warn people, tried to tell my story to anyone who would listen, but most folks just smile politely and change the subject, unwilling to believe that such horrors could exist in the modern world. They prefer to think that evil is something that happens in movies or history books, something that belongs to other times and other places, not something that could be lurking just beneath the surface of the American heartland. But I know better, because I've seen the scratches on the walls and smelled the stench of corruption that clings to places where humanity has been systematically destroyed. I know that there are farms out there where the corn grows too tall and the harvest never ends, where the soil is rich with the remains of people who asked too many questions or wandered too far from the safety of civilization. I know that there are families who have been keeping these secrets for generations, passing down their twisted knowledge like a hereditary curse, and I know that somewhere in the darkness beyond our suburban streetlights, they're still out there, still practicing their ancient trade, still feeding their hungry fields with whatever prey stumbles into their web. The only thing that gives me any peace is the hope that someday, someone braver and luckier than me will finally put an end to their reign of terror, will find a way to break the cycle of sacrifice and suffering that has been going on for far too long in the hidden corners of our world. That hope is what keeps me going during the sleepless nights and the anxiety-filled days, the knowledge that truth has a way of surfacing eventually, that justice may be slow, but it's usually inevitable when enough people finally wake up and pay attention. My story has been told in court transcripts and police reports, in newspaper articles and true crime documentaries, and each time it reaches a new audience I receive letters from people who have their own stories to tell, their own encounters with places and people that don't quite fit into the normal world. Some of them are clearly disturbed individuals seeking attention, but others carry the unmistakable ring of truth, the authentic voice of someone who has seen things they wish they could forget. Together, we form an informal network of survivors and witnesses, people who understand that the darkness is real and that vigilance is the price of keeping it at bay. We share information about suspicious properties and strange disappearances, about families with too many secrets and communities that are a little too isolated for their own good. It's not much, but it's something. And maybe someday it will be enough to prevent another innocent person from walking into a trap like the one that nearly claimed my life at Red Creek Farm. Until then, I continue to watch and wait and remember, carrying the burden of knowledge that I wouldn't wish on anyone but that I can never completely set down. The harvest of evil never truly ends, but as long as there are people willing to bear witness to its existence, there's always hope that the next crop might be a little smaller, the next season a little shorter, the next sacrifice prevented before it can feed the hungry soil of places where darkness has taken root and flourished for far too long. If you're still watching this video, if you've made it through my entire story without turning away in disbelief or disgust, then I want you to remember one thing above all else. Evil thrives in silence and secrecy, in places where people are afraid to ask questions or challenge what they've been told is normal. Final warning: the men who hunted me through that cornfield were counting on my silence, on the assumption that I would be too frightened or too ashamed to tell anyone what I'd seen, and they'd been right about countless victims before me. But I survived, and I've spent the last 50 years making sure that their secrets didn't die with me, making sure that the truth about Red Creek Farm became part of the public record where it could serve as a warning to others who might encounter similar situations. The scratches on those basement walls were made by people who died believing that no one would ever know what happened to them, that their suffering would be forgotten along with their lives. But I carry their memory with me every day as a reminder that bearing witness is sometimes the most important thing we can do for those who can no longer speak for themselves. I may never know all their names, may never be able to give their families the closure they deserve, but I can make sure that their deaths meant something, that their sacrifice helped expose the network of evil that claimed them and prevented it from claiming others. The harvest at Red Creek Farm ended in 1972, but the work of remembering and warning others will continue as long as I have breath in my body and strength in my voice to tell this story to anyone willing to listen. If you want to hear more true horror stories from the dark corners of America, check out our other videos where real people share their encounters with the unexplained and the unthinkable.